Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the Pharma R&D Annual Review 2023 from Sightline, with me, Ian Lloyd, Senior Director for Pharma Projects.
And me, Alex Shimmings, Executive Editor for Europe for Scrip.
So let's take a look at our agenda before we get underway for this afternoon, in the UK where we are. We're going to be looking at the drug R&D pipeline in 2023 and how it's changed since previous years. We'll be starting off looking at the total pipeline size as of early January 2023. So all of the data in this presentation refers to the Pharma R&D annual report, which was published earlier in the year, and the data cut was taken at the start of January. Then we'll be looking at the success stories, the novel drugs which were launched in the previous calendar year, 2022. Then we'll be slicing and dicing the current pipeline in a number of different ways, looking at the top companies in R&D, the leading therapies and diseases, and the leading mechanisms and targets. Then we'll be spending a bit of time looking at key trends specific to 2022-2023, how COVID is starting to wane, and therefore so is R&D into this disease. Then looking at the rise in rare diseases, the continuing increase in cell and gene therapy, and the rise of R&D in China. And then we'll be rounding off by looking at the outlook for 2023. First of all, looking at launches expected from drugs approved late in 2022, and then looking at drug approvals to look out for in 2023. And finally, we hope to have a bit of time for questions at the end. If you have a question during the presentation, please do pop it into the attendee questions box. If we don't get to your question live, we will attempt to get back to you in the next few days with an answer to your question. Also, please note that the presentation is being recorded. There's a lot of data on these slides, so you don't need to scribble anything down. We'll be sending you a link with a recording of the presentation, including all of the slides. Okay, let's get started then with a look at the total size of the drug R&D pipeline in 2023. And it's worth starting with a definition here, what we mean by pipeline. So Pharma Projects covers all drugs in development by commercial concerns, so companies, not universities, all the way through the discovery stages, through preclinical development, the various phases of clinical trials, the filing and approval stages. And it does also include in the pipeline some drugs which are already launched, which are still under development for additional markets or for new diseases, but any drugs whose development is effectively complete are not included in the count. And this applies across all of the graphs you're going to be seeing today. So here is the total pipeline size for 2023, standing now at 21,292 drugs under active development. The total pipeline size has grown 5.9% since the same time point last year. This is a slightly smaller expansion rate than we saw in the previous 12 months, where it was up 8.2%, and it falls a little bit behind the 5-year average we've seen of 6.9%. But interestingly, if you do rolling 5-year averages across the 5-year periods, you'll see it's really going up. There are 1,183 more drugs in development at the moment than there were some last year. However, during the 12 months, 5,082 new drugs were actually added to our database. And this is considerably fewer than the 6,343 seen in 2022. And if you can do the math, you can see that that means that 3,899 drugs exited the R&D pipeline during the year, which is a considerable rate of churn. Some of these drugs will have been discontinued. A small number might have been withdrawn from the market, but the vast majority of these drugs were probably drugs in early development, mostly preclinical, where they simply were just not heard of again. And we have a process in place to remove those drugs from the pipeline once we've researched to see if they're still in development. Of the new drugs added, 40.7% were anti-cancers, 13.5% were neurologicals, and 19.5% were for rare diseases. And we'll be coming back to rare diseases later on. Now, of course, the pipeline is mostly drugs not launched, so it's mostly expense rather than income. So really to get a better handle on how well the pharmaceutical industry is doing, we really should be looking at the new active substances drugs launched during 2022. So this graph tells you the number of new active substances launched by year. And you can see that 2022 did see a fall after the record-breaking year we saw in 2021, which was somewhat related to the COVID spike. However, it still means that 2022 was the third best year ever, and there's a continued upward trend. As you can see, since the start of the millennium, it's really kind of more than doubled in size, the number of new drugs we're getting to the market every year. So there were 64 new drugs launched and an additional 10 new vaccines. Where are these new active substances making their debuts in the world? Well, you can see that the US continues to dominate with 28 of the new active substance launches occurring there, accounting for about 38% of new active substance launches. The interesting thing is here that up until a couple of years ago, the US generally accounted for more than half, so basically more than all of the other countries in the world added up. And this has been coming down. And the reason for this is really Asia. So we can see on this pie chart here that both China and Japan together contributed as many new active substance drug launches as the US did. And if you add up all of the other Asian markets, you'll now actually see that Asia accounts for more countries where drugs debut than North America does. Looking at the therapeutic categories for the drugs which debuted, you won't be surprised to see, I don't think, that cancer came out top, accounting for roughly a quarter of all new drugs launched. Anti-infectives did pretty well again, although again, the numbers are still slightly being skewed by COVID. There are actually 7 novel COVID vaccines launched throughout the year. And then coming after that, we see dermatological, which had an unusually good year, and alimentary metabolic. Which were the leading companies in terms of bringing new drugs to market? There's a very interesting headline here in that for the first time, we see a Chinese company as the most successful company in the world for bringing new drugs to the market. Jiangsu Hengrui was the only company to bring 4 drugs to the market, and it's 13th in terms of its size of its pipeline. You'll then see 3 firms of the more traditional Western big pharma companies, which launched 3 drugs: Sanofi, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Roche. And within this table here, you'll see 2 smaller companies, Idorsia and Zydus, which both launched 2 drugs, and they had the best NAS to pipeline size ratio. And now I'm going to hand over to Alex, who's going to look at the subclass of those new active substance launches, which are classed as novel. Alex.
Thanks, Ian. So this part of the presentation is going to focus exclusively on new active substances. And to be specific, we define those as new chemical or biological entities where the active ingredient has received no prior approval for human use. So this includes vaccines with novel antigenic components, but it excludes reformulations, biosimilars, and imaging agents. So in this section, we're going to look at those products that debuted last year that were first in class. And we can see where a product has more than one mechanism of action, the novel mechanism is marked with an asterisk. So we start with 3 NASs launched for the first time in Japan, and these were all for cancer indications. First up, we have Daiichi Sankyo's Ezhamia. This was approved for adult T-cell leukemia lymphoma, which is a rare blood cancer. It's a dual EZH1/2 inhibitor, with the EZH1 being the novel mechanism. So it joins Eisai's Tazverik, that was on last year's list as the first EZH2 inhibitor, and it's another win for the emerging epigenetics field. Next is Nippon Kayaku and Solasia Pharma's Davius, which was launched for peripheral T-cell lymphoma. So Davius is believed to exert its anti-cancer effects by inducing cell cycle arrest and apoptosis. So the hope is that it'll have an effect across many cancer types, since it doesn't rely on a specific antigen or receptor. Then Taiho and Otsuka's Joselhi, and this inhibits HSP90. It was launched in Japan for gastrointestinal stromal tumors that have progressed following chemotherapy. And in a phase 3 trial, it was shown to double progression-free survival compared with placebo. So this slide shows the 3 other novel anti-cancers that were launched last year. And first we have Aruishu, which is a small molecule extracted from the traditional Chinese herb known as horny goatweed, which is used as a natural version of Viagra. However, here it's actually been approved for hepatocellular carcinoma, and it acts as a myeloid differentiation primary response 88 inhibitor. So Huadong Medicine describes it as the first anti-tumor small molecule immunomodulator that's based on traditional Chinese medicine that's been approved in China. And as such, it's eligible for traditional Chinese medicine protection status. And so it gets 10 years of exclusivity. And CTI Biopharma launched Vonjo, and that's a selective JAK2 inhibitor. And that was in the US for use in myelofibrosis. But it's counted here as novel for one of its many other mechanisms, and that's inhibiting interleukin receptor-associated protein kinase, or IRAK. So IRAKs play a role in the adaptive immune response. CTIs are seeking partners for the product outside the US, where it's not yet progressed beyond phase 3. And then finally on this slide, we have Bristol Myers Squibb's Opdualag for melanoma. And this is one of the 3 launches for that company last year that Ian just mentioned. It contains the LAG-3 blocking relatlimab, which is the NAS here, as well as the anti-PD-1 product nivolumab. So relatlimab is the first immunotherapy approved against LAG-3, an immune checkpoint receptor. The other thing about Opdualag is that it's the first fixed-dose combination of 2 immunotherapies to reach the market. Obviously, it's not uncommon for immunotherapies to be given together, so it's going to be interesting to see whether other companies choose to take the same approach. But so far, there seem to be few similar combinations in the pipeline. So on this slide, we're moving on to novel treatments for metabolic disorders. We've got PTC's Upstaza, which is a one-time gene replacement therapy, and it's the first approved disease-modifying treatment for AADC deficiency, which is a rare genetic neurometabolic syndrome. The disease results in impaired synthesis of dopamine, so that causes multiple symptoms to appear not long after birth, such as dystonia and developmental delay. So the therapy is actually delivered directly into the brain, and like many of the gene therapies, it's coming in at a high price of about €3 million per treatment. However, the US, the product's hit a bit of a delay because the FDA has asked for more bioanalytical data, but the firm still hopes to file a BLA in the 3rd quarter. Next, we've got Sanofi's Xenpozyme, which was first launched in Japan for Niemann-Pick disease type B, which is also known as acid sphingomyelinase deficiency. US and EU regulators have also followed suit with approvals there. So Xenpozyme is the first disease-specific treatment for NPD type B, and it acts by replacing the deficient enzyme. And it joins Johnson & Johnson's Zavesca, which was launched back in 2009 for the related type C Niemann-Pick disease. And there seems to be little in the way of potential competition in the pipeline for that. Next, Agios Pharmaceuticals is targeting another rare genetic disorder with Pyrukynd. This is a first-in-class oral pyruvate kinase inhibitor, and it's become the first treatment for pyruvate kinase deficiency. And this is where patients have low levels of the enzyme that converts glucose into energy in the red blood cells. So as a result, the red blood cells break down before the body has time to replace them, and that produces hemolytic anemia. This is just the first indication for Pyrukynd, though. It's also in late-stage development for thalassemia and sickle cell disease too. Now, this slide covers off 3 more Japanese novel launches, and this time for more inflammatory conditions. So we've got Carogra, which was developed by EA Pharma and Kisai Pharmaceuticals, and it's the world's first alpha-4 integrin antagonist. It was approved in March and then launched in May in Japan for use in ulcerative colitis. So Carogra acts on both the alpha-4 beta-1 and alpha-4 beta-7 integrins, and those are expressed on the surface of inflammatory cells. So it acts to suppress their invasion into the inflamed site in the colonic mucosa in ulcerative colitis patients. Then we have Boehringer Ingelheim's Spayvigo, which targets the interleukin 36 receptor and was first launched in the US for generalized pustular psoriasis. So IL-36 it's another pro-inflammatory cytokine, and it activates T cells and interleukin 2. So with that broad anti-inflammatory effect, Boehringer is planning to extend its use into other autoimmune conditions. It's got phase 3 trials underway in ulcerative colitis, phase 2 trials in Crohn's and atopic dermatitis. And those are just some of the indications. However, there is some competition on the horizon with Anaptys Bio. It has a similar product in phase 3 trials. Then we have Maruho and Roche, which launched Michgar in Japan for atopic eczema, and that was in August. So Michgar hits the receptor for interleukin 31, another inflammatory cytokine, which helps trigger cell-mediated immunity. And it has been identified as a major player in a number of chronic inflammatory conditions. However, again, no other drugs using this strategy appear to be in development at the moment. And here we're going to look at two novel products for diabetes. So we're starting with Lilly's blockbuster in waiting Mounjaro, which has got off to a fantastic start on the market. And that was following its launch for type 2 diabetes in the US in June. So Mounjaro is a dual agonist and it acts on the gastric inhibitory polypeptide receptor and the glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor, with the former of those mechanisms being the novel one. So Lilly's just posted first quarter revenues of more than $568 million for the product already, and those were above analyst expectations. And that makes it already the company's fourth best-selling drug. And also its market is set to expand further into obesity. And here it's going to go up against its key rival from Novo Nordisk, which is Wegovy, the GLP-1 analog. So Lilly's going to file the product in the US and EU for obesity, doing that at the moment, hopes for regulatory action by the end of the year. And it's so confident in its products, it's also just announced it's going to run a head-to-head trial against Wegovy in obesity. So it's setting up for a real market battle there. Moving on to the next novel diabetes therapy, it's Pharma and Bayer's. They launched Huatangning, which is the world's first hexakinase activator drug, and that was in Japan. And this is the first time that a global first-in-class drug for type 2 diabetes actually made its debut in the country. So it's another sign of the ascendancy of the Chinese market. The product works by restoring the impaired glucose sensor hexakinase in the pancreas, intestine, and liver. So on this slide, we've got novel products for a range of other diseases, and we're starting with Gilead Sciences' Sunlenca. So Gilead's obviously been a leader in HIV for many years. The company's now added to its portfolio with this product, which is the first HIV capsid assembly inhibitor. So as such, it's hitting the virus at a later stage in its life cycle than most of the other established mechanisms in HIV, and that's when the virus reassembles itself, ready to break out of the cell and infect other cells. Gilead's got some high hopes for the molecule. At the moment, it's there for rescue therapy population, but it's hoping it's going to become a backbone therapy for more larger HIV treatment populations and ultimately be used in pre-exposure prophylaxis. Again, this is another product with little competition. Its closest competitors are actually way back in phase 1 development. Then in ophthalmology, Roche has launched Vabysmo for wet age-related macular degeneration and diabetic macular edema, and that was in Japan in May. So this product is a bispecific monoclonal, and it binds to the established VEGF receptor and also a new target, angiopoietin-2. This drug has enjoyed a strong launch already. It debuted in the US and it's being rolled out in Japan and across Europe. And at the moment, it has a dosing advantage against its older rivals, with intervals of up to 4 months between injections. And that compares with every 2 months for Regeneron's Eylea, which is the main drug. However, Regeneron's fighting back. It wants to neutralize this advantage, and it's trying to get its own 4-monthly high-dose regimen of Eylea approved. And there should be a decision on that in the US this summer. And then we have Merck & Co. It acquired Afferent Pharmaceuticals in 2016, and with it, it got Lifnual, which is the world's first purina receptor P2X3 antagonist to gain approval for chronic cough. This is another of the agents which made it to the market in Japan first, and it's also been filed in the US and EU. But in the US, the FDA has issued a complete response letter. It wants more information on how its efficacy was measured. So its fate there remains a little more uncertain. And then this slide follows the final trio of novel NASs launched last year, and we started with argenx Vyvgart for myasthenia gravis. So this is a human IgG1 antibody fragment, and it's a first-in-class neonatal Fc receptor blocker. And it also marks argenx's first ever regulatory approval. So the drug promotes the degradation and clearance of IgG autoantibodies, and a subcutaneous formulation is also being developed and is being filed in the US. A decision for that expected in June. Vyvgart is also being evaluated in other diseases where IgG autoantibodies are involved. And next, we have the only first-in-class compound in the cardiovascular area, and that's Bristol Myers Squibb's Camzyos for obstructive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So this drug's a myosin inhibitor, and it acts to rebalance muscle contractility. So BMS has already warned that uptake of the drug would be slow, and that's after Camzyos was approved with a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, and that was to cover its potential to cause systolic dysfunction. Indeed, like first quarter sales this year totaled only 29 million, and that was just shy of consensus as well. So it's a long way to go before it can recoup the 13 billion that Bristol paid for the drug's originator, which was Myocardia. And then lastly on this slide, we have Tezspire, and that's a monoclonal antibody that targets the thymic stromal lymphopoietin to block multiple asthma-related inflammatory cytokine cascades. So Tezspire has the benefit of having very low immunogenicity, which has been a limitation for other biologics. So Amgen, the originator, partnered with the respiratory specialist AstraZeneca, and the drug's now been approved across EU and Japan. It's also in development for 5 more respiratory and inflammatory related indications, and so it should expand Tezspire's franchise. So that finishes the first-in-class NISs, and we're now going to take a look at some of the more interesting other notable new active substances which were launched last year. And again, we're going to start with 3 products for cancer. So we've got Roche's Lunsumio, which gained a conditional authorization in the EU in May, marking the first approval for a CD20 and CD3 T-cell engaging bispecific antibody anywhere in the world. It was approved for follicular lymphoma patients who have received at least 2 prior systemic therapies, and Roche is positioning it as a more convenient alternative to Novartis's Kymriah, which was also approved for follicular lymphoma last year. So the approval should help keep Lunsumio ahead of its rivals in the same class, and most notably that is Genmab and AbbVie's epcoritamab. Next, we have Immunocore, which achieved several firsts with the US approval of Kimmtrak. It was the first approved T-cell receptor therapy, the first drug approved for metastatic uveal melanoma, and Immunocore's first approved product. So Kimmtrak is a bispecific GP100 peptide HLA-directed CD3 T-cell engager immunotherapy, and it was approved in the US in January, a month before its FDA user fee date. EU approval followed in April, and the product's got off to a strong start on the market, sales of $141 million in 2022, and in the first quarter of 2023, it pulled in $52 million. And then on this slide, we have another new anti-cancer that's also got off to a strong start, and that's Novartis's radioligand therapy Pluvicto for prostate cancer, and that followed a US launch in May. And it's done well despite some supply issues for the product. So this approval marked as with the culmination of several years of research into nuclear medicines technology, which Novartis acquired when it bought Advanced Accelerator Applications in 2018 for $3.9 billion. So Novartis has already launched 1 drug from this platform, and that was Lutathera, but that was for a much smaller indication. And the company's goal has always been to expand it to a larger treatment setting, such as prostate cancer with Pluvicto. So it generated 271 million sales in 2022, and Novartis is currently expanding its production to keep up with demand. And then here we have 3 more interesting new anti-cancers, and we start with Mirati Therapeutics Krazati, and that became only the 2nd KRAS inhibitor when it reached the market just before the end of the year, and it was also Mirati's first commercial product. Mirati priced Krazati at a slight premium to the first KRAS inhibitor, which is Amgen's Lumakras, which was launched for the same non-small cell lung indication back in May 2021. Krazati looks to have slightly better efficacy, but on the other hand, it has more safety warnings than Lumakras, so it remains to be seen whether it'll have any kind of competitive edge. And both products are actually also in phase 3 trials for use in colorectal cancer. Next, we have AstraZeneca's Imjudo, which finally became the 2nd CTLA-4 inhibitor on the market after it was approved in October for use in combination with AstraZeneca's PD-L1 inhibitor Imfinzi in hepatocellular carcinoma. So Imjudo experienced numerous setbacks in its development, but in the end, the FDA approval, which was based on the Himalaya trial, marked the first for a CTLA-4 plus PD-1 or L1 combination treatment in first-line liver cancer. Now, that frontline indication put it ahead of Bristol Myers Squibb's Yervoy and Opdivo, that combination, because that is approved for second-line liver cancer. Then in November, the Imfinzi and Judo combination got an additional approval in the US for metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, and that was based on the Poseidon trial. And then late in the year, J&J launched its third multiple myeloma product in the US, and that followed the October approval of Tecvayli, and that was for the fifth-line treatment of myeloma. So Tecvayli is a bispecific antibody that targets BCMA and CD3 on T cells. And as it's an off-the-shelf therapy, the hope is that it can step into the gap that's been left by the manufacturing issues that are affecting CAR T therapies, including J&J's own Carvykti. So Tecvayli's approval following that of Carvykti has marked the next step in J&J's bid to build a multi-drug myeloma franchise to build on the blockbuster Darzalex. And then the last slide in this section departs from anti-cancers, and we start with BioMarin, whose persistence with Roctavian paid off when the European Commission made it the first haemophilia A gene therapy to be approved anywhere in the world, and that was in August. So BioMarin had hoped to price Roctavian at about $1.5 million in euros for each patient, but it's actually struggling with reimbursement in Germany, which is raising concerns that it's might lead to another failed European gene therapy launch. And that was following Bluebird Bio's withdrawal of Zynteglo from the German market back in 2021 because of reimbursement problems. And in fact, BioMarin's actually already downgraded its revenue expectations for the product because of this. And then in the US, it has had some setbacks there, but the company is still hoping to bring it to the market there and is expecting an FDA decision by the end of June. And then Sanofi with Enjaymo, it's going to be drawing on its experience in drugs that treat rare blood disorders with this rollout. And Enjaymo is the first approved drug to treat cold agglutinin disease. And it's forming part of Sanofi's efforts, really to build out its rare blood disease franchise. So Enjaymo received US approval in February to decrease the need for red blood cell transfusions due to hemolysis in these patients. And it was launched there in July. Drug targets complement factor 1S and is meant to prevent the destruction of red blood cells. And then Sanofi actually acquired Enjaymo when it bought Bioverativ in 2018 for $11.6 billion. And then finally, we have Bristol Myers Squibb's tyrosine kinase 2 inhibitor, so TYK2. And it's the first new oral therapy for psoriasis in nearly 10 years. The company's got some big ideas for the product. It wants it to become this new standard of care oral treatment for psoriasis and unseat Amgen's PDE4 inhibitor Otezla. The FDA approved TYK2 in September, and it had a label that doesn't include the class warnings that affect other JAK inhibitors because of safety concerns. So it has the benefit there. And psoriasis is only the first of a number of inflammatory conditions that BMS is actually pursuing for TYK2. So now I'm going to hand back to Ian, who's going to have a look at the 2023 pipeline in much more detail.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, I'm going to look at the current pipeline by a number of different filters. First of all, by global status. So this is the most advanced stage a drug has got for any disease or any indication or by any company in the world. And you can see that around half of the pipeline is still concentrated in the preclinical stage with 11,835 drugs. There's considerable attrition between phase 1 and phase 2, but somewhat counterintuitively, the actual numbers for phase 1 and phase 2 are actually very similar. And this is really because although fewer drugs make it into phase 2, the phase 2 development stage takes longer. So you get a kind of a pile-up effect in phase 2. You can actually see the preclinical number, the growth rate declined slightly this year. It was 11% in 2022 and 4.3% in 2023. There was a relatively even distribution in the increases in clinical phases, with phase 1 up by 10.7%, phase 2 by 7.2%, and phase 3 by 9.8%. And in contrast to some of the previous years, there's growth really across the global status range here, whereas in previous years, we've seen it largely concentrated in the earlier stages. Looking at the clinical stages in a bit more detail, you can see the number of drugs in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials going back to 2007 here. And you can really see that the number of drugs in both phase 1 and phase 2 has really taken off in previous years. In phase 3, there was a period from about 2017 onwards where things were looking a bit flat, which is obviously a little bit worrying. But you can see again in the past couple of years, things have started to pick up again and post-pandemic. Let's move to look at the top 10 companies by their pipeline size. And here you can see the top 10. Not much change, some small changes with minor shuffles in the rankings. But the headline news here is that Roche unseated Novartis, ending its 6-year reign at #1 and becoming the largest company by pipeline size. The rest of the top 5 is unchanged. You'll notice the numbers for most of the companies in the top 10 have fallen slightly, with only Bristol and Pfizer having slightly larger pipelines than they did this time last year. And this is partly due to the fact that there was relatively quiet time for mergers and acquisitions and deals in the top 10 pharma. So not many of the companies were able to add to their pipelines by big acquisitions. And this is further emphasized by this graph here. What you can see here is the percentage which the top 10 pharma companies contributed to the entire pipeline, graphed by year. And you can see that as of 2023, those top 10 pharma companies are only providing 4.1% of all drugs in R&D, declining from 4.6% a year ago, and continuing a really quite dramatic decline, which was nearly 14% in 2011. And that's the blue line at the bottom. The orange line gives you the same information for the top 25, and it's telling you the same story there. The grey line at the top shows you the contribution by small companies, companies with just 1 or 2 drugs. That's hovering around the 17, 18, 19% market. So with that being the same, we can divine the fact that probably the growth in the pipeline size is largely coming from companies in the mid-tier. Here is the disease focus for the top 10 pharma companies. And you can see that cancer remains the primary focus for most of the top 10. That's the kind of cyan colored bar, one up from the bottom. Eli Lilly actually is the only company in the top 10 which doesn't have most of its drugs in cancer. It has a primary focus in alimentary and metabolic. You also see that Big Pharma does still maintain diverse portfolios. There's a kind of a received wisdom in the industry that large companies are switching their focus to 3 or 4 key therapeutic areas. Our data doesn't show that really happening as yet. In fact, 3 of the 10 in the top 10 are active across all 14 therapeutic areas, and the other 7 are only emitting compounds falling into the relatively minor therapeutic areas, such as hormonal products and antiparasitics. What about the total number of companies with active pipelines in 2023? Well, this stands this year at 5,529. Another expansion, up 2.1%. But again, as with the total pipeline size, a smaller rate of expansion than we saw in the previous year when it went up by 6.2%. So there are fewer than 1,000 additional companies this year. 809 new companies were added to our database versus 1,042 in the previous year. And this means that 696 companies exited the R&D narrative. Some of these would have gone bust. Some of them would have been acquired. But again, the vast majority will have probably gone into slumber mode, or we've received no new information about them. And we find that many of these companies are never heard of again. Interestingly, more than half of all the companies in this figure are these tiny companies with just 1 or 2 drugs. There are 825 companies with 2 drugs in their pipelines, and a huge 2,083 with just a single drug candidate. Moving to look at the R&D pipeline by therapeutic area, and you can see the 2023 numbers to the right in green and the 2022 to the left in blue. You probably won't be surprised to see that oncology remains the biggest therapeutic area. 39.8% of all drugs in development are targeting at least one cancer disease. This is up from 39% a year ago, and considerably up from 30% where it was 10 years ago. And the cancer pipeline expanded by 9.1% this year, so outpacing the overall expansion in pipeline size. In contrast, neurologicals in second grew by 4.6%, and alimentary and metabolic in third by 4.7%, so showing a slightly lower expansion rate than the overall pipeline size. Looking at the individual top 10 diseases or indications which drugs in the pipeline are targeting, we can see that breast cancer remains top, and with an increase in momentum with an 8.7% increase in its pipeline size. But non-small cell lung cancer in the second position is closing the gap. That saw a really big 11.2% pipeline expansion. You also saw pancreatic cancer moving at an even bigger rate with a 14.2% increase. And you'll also note that 8 of the top 10 are in fact cancer indications. You'll see that COVID sliding down from its peak at number 3 to number 5, and the only other non-cancer indication is Alzheimer's disease, holding steady at number 8 after the Aduhelm launch. Looking at mechanisms of action, so it's worth pointing out at the start that in pharma projects we use a hierarchical mechanism of action classification. So this tends to mean that drugs early in the pipeline are given kind of broader categories, as quite often it's not disclosed until later on their precise mechanism of action, or in some cases it's not even known. So this top 10 does tend to favor these broad categories that we use. You'll see that immuno-oncology is the number 1, and in fact almost 1 in 6 of all drugs in the pipeline are immuno-oncology drugs these days, which is really quite extraordinary considering this strategy really only came to the fore around the kind of the end of the first decade of this millennium. Some of the other broad immuno-oncology categories also feature in this top 10, such as T-cell stimulants and immune checkpoint inhibitors. Protein degraders stay in the top 10 with a notable expansion, but there are a few changes among the rest. So it's often more informative to look at the individual protein targets which drugs are hitting. And this year we have a change in the number 1 again, with CD274, which is better known as PDL1, now the single most targeted protein for all drugs in R&D. And it's further cementing the dominance of immuno-oncology as the kind of strategy du jour in pharma R&D currently. With the change in the number 1 spot, CD3E slips down to number 2, and another previous number 1 title holder, HER2, has slipped down to number 4. Entering the top 3 is CD19, which is a common target for CAR T cell therapies. So having kind of looked at the major categories we can slice and dice the pipeline by, let's look at some key trends that were specific for 2022, focusing on COVID-19, rare diseases, cell and gene therapy, and R&D in China. Here we see the number of new therapeutics, prophylactics, and complication therapies for COVID-19 that we added to the database by month since the start of the pandemic. And unsurprisingly, the peak of the R&D effort was around April 2020, around the peak of the first wave of the pandemic, where you can see that huge spike in new drugs, vaccines, and complication therapies being reported. You can also see the rise of the Omicron variant brought a modest revival in the first half of 2021. But you also see that in 2022, things have kind of started to stabilize, and now COVID-19 is becoming endemic rather than pandemic. We expect this trend to continue. It may even go down a little bit further in 2023. All of the top 10 pharma companies still maintain some involvement in activity against COVID, although there's been a kind of a disparity now between those most involved and those least involved. Pfizer has 19 drugs, up from 11 last year, and AstraZeneca 10, up from 8. And obviously these 2 companies are well known for being early entrants into the vaccine market here. In contrast, Merck & Co. is the top 10 pharma company with the least interest in COVID, with just 2 drugs now. Moving on to rare diseases, this graph shows you the number of individual rare diseases which pharma R&D is targeting by year. And you can see there's been a massive increase really in the last decade. We're now at 718 individual rare diseases being targeted, up from 677 last year, and it's nearly doubled in 10 years. The number of drugs in development for rare diseases stands at 6,682. Representing nearly a third of all drugs in R&D. So that means nearly a third of all drugs in R&D are targeting at least one rare disease. And that number goes up as well, up from 6,080 last year. This pie chart shows you the spread of rare diseases by therapeutic area. So not the numbers of drugs, but the number of actual rare diseases being targeted. And this shows you that alimentary and metabolic accounts for the largest share of rare disorders. And not surprisingly, as lots of the rare diseases or genetic disorders fall into this category. but in fact, it only accounts for 7% of rare drug R&D. Anti-infectives and neurologicals follow in this chart. Cancer is only fourth by number of rare diseases, but accounts for the largest share of drugs against rare diseases. Rare diseases are not surprisingly a big focus for Big Pharma. The top 10 pharma companies here targeting rare diseases are shown. And here we have Novartis, which is number 2 in the overall pipeline chart, and number 1 in the rare disease chart, with 66.5% of its pipeline targeting at least one rare disease. Bristol Myers Squibb and Pfizer are close behind, but actually Merck KGaA has the highest share of its pipeline, with a massive nearly 85% of its drugs targeting at least one rare disease. There's one slight anomaly in this graph worth pointing out. We do classify the Medicines for Malaria venture as a company for our purposes, and not surprisingly, as you can tell by the name, all of its drugs are against malaria. Surprisingly, perhaps to some, malaria is classed as a rare disease because our definition looks at incidences and prevalences in the US and the EU, and clearly malaria is more endemic in South America and Africa and other tropical regions. The number of clinical trial starts in rare diseases by year is shown in this graph, with 2022 showing a new high in rare disease trial starts. In fact, there were a quarter more rare disease trial starts in 2022 than the previous year. Overall in trials, oncology continued to dominate with over 17,000 trials, an 8.7% increase, and CNS showing an impressive increase of 10%. The COVID bubble for clinical trials does seem to have well and truly burst, with both ongoing and planned trials having fallen since last year. This is also represented by the number of orphan drug statuses granted, expedited review statuses granted, and emergency authorizations granted by year here. You can see there were 525 orphan drug statuses granted, making last year the second largest, approaching the peak in 2017. There was a slight dip in expedited review statuses granted at 316, down from the record high we saw in 341. Meanwhile, the EUAs fell back considerably, and that's probably because this strategy was used particularly in the pandemic to get new drugs to the market to treat the COVID-19 very quickly. The other big trend we've been noticing for several years now, which continues again this year, is the ongoing rise of cell and gene therapies. So you can see here, once again, for both cell and gene therapies, we have record numbers of drugs in the pipeline now, breaking a new record year on year for the last 10 years. So for gene therapies, this includes in vivo and ex vivo gene therapies. So things like CAR T are classified as both a cell therapy, as they are cells, but also as a gene therapy, as there is genetic manipulation involved. So in fact, there are 1,197 drugs which are classified as both cell and gene therapies. There are 886 gene therapies that don't have a cellular component. So these are the kind of the direct in vivo gene therapies, and 852 cell therapies which don't have genetic manipulation. So these areas are very closely intertwined. What are the most common viral vectors used in gene therapy? Well, as you can see here, the adeno-associated viral vector is the most popular. That's mostly used for in vivo gene therapeutics. It did show a slight small this year, down from 2022 figures, 2022's figure of 483 to 466. And while most of its pipeline is still at preclinical, there's quite a significant number of drugs in phase 2 and a few in later stages. The lentivirus was the second most commonly used vector. In contrast, this is usually used in ex vivo transfection. That's also shown a modest decrease in the previous year. Looking at the cell types used in cell therapy, not surprisingly, T cells are the most common type by far. Obviously, all the CAR T therapies we mentioned earlier are included in this number, and this number has increased at 976, up from 909 in the previous year. Stem cells are in second place, dropping slightly from 448 to 437. The actual bar at the most right-hand side is actually the biggest bar. This includes other cell types, of which there actually is a myriad of different kinds of cell types. So a very broad and diverse area of research here. And lastly, another word about China. So this pie chart shows you the headquarters of companies in pharma R&D by country or region. You can see that 43% of companies are based out of the UK, but China is advancing the second largest individual country, with 808 companies, up from 792 last year. So we've seen China really in the last decade expand hugely from quite a low beginning, but we did see a beginning perhaps of things leveling off there in the numbers from last year. Where is drug R&D actually occurring? Well, you can see that of all drugs in development, over half, 51.1%, have some activity occurring in the US. So the US, again, is still the dominant market. However, the US's share fell from 53.4% to 51.1%. And it seems this came almost entirely at the thanks to China, which increased its share from 23.6% to 20.8%. So it's worth really pausing to note here that we think of pharma R&D as being still primarily Western focused, but in fact, nearly a quarter of all drugs in development have some development occurring at this time in China. So that's the end of our whistle-stop tour of pharma R&D for 2022. So let's finish off by taking a look at 2023. And for this, I'm going to hand back to Alex, who's looking at drugs likely to be launched this year.
Thanks, Ian. So now we're going to look at drugs that were set to appear on next year's NAS list. And first up, we're looking at the neurological diseases. And we start with probably the most notable, and that's Eisai and Biogen's Leqembi for Alzheimer's disease. So the anti-amyloid beta protofibril antibody gained its first accelerated approval from the FDA in early January, and that followed the controversy surrounding the approval of Biogen's first Alzheimer's therapy, Aduhelm, previously. So Leqembi is ahead of its nearest rival, Lilly's donanemab, although this has just produced some promising data from its Trailblazer-ALZ 2 phase 3 trial. And the gap between the two products isn't that wide, because Lilly will file for traditional approval this quarter for donanemab, while Eisai and Biogen should hear back from the FDA on its decision on full approval for Leqembi in July. And it may achieve a Medicare coverage decision soon after. Then if donanemab's BLA is granted a priority review, it could get an FDA decision by the end of the year, with a CMS decision soon after that. So that is shaping up to be a very exciting area. Next, we have Reata Pharmaceuticals. It's looking hopefully at a wide open commercial opportunity following the approval of Skyclarys as the first approved drug for Friedreich's ataxia, which is a rare neurodegenerative disease. And it's also the first disease associated with mitochondrial dysfunction to have an FDA-approved treatment. Now, the approval did come as a bit of a surprise because there was some uncertainty about the strength of the efficacy evidence for it, and also its precise mechanism is unknown. Even so, a European launch is expected by early 2024. And then a launch is planned in July for Pfizer's migraine treatment Zavspret, and this is an intranasal CGRP inhibitor, and it's the second migraine drug from Pfizer's $11.6 billion acquisition of Biohaven last year. And Pfizer hopes that this portfolio is going to grow into a $6 billion franchise. So Zavspret was approved as an acute treatment, and it's going to be marketed alongside Pfizer's oral CGRP inhibitor Nurtec ODT. Because Zavspret is inhaled, it can deliver quicker symptom relief than a pill, and it also provides an alternative for patients who are experiencing nausea and vomiting with their migraines. And the list price is expected to be comparable to other CGRP therapies. Next, we're going to look at some neurological and infectious diseases. We've got Acadia Pharmaceuticals. It obtained a US approval for Daybue, which is a synthetic analog of the amino-terminal tripeptide of IGF-1. And that's the first drug approved for Rett syndrome. That came in March, and then launch followed in April. So Rett syndrome is another neurodevelopmental disease, and it occurs mostly in girls between the ages of 6 and 18 months. It causes motor function deficits, cognitive issues, and gastro problems. They hope for peak annual sales of the product between $500 and $600 million. Next, we have the respiratory syncytial virus market, and that's about to benefit from a nice burst of innovation after many years of very little in the way of new products. And we've got 2 vaccines predicted to reach the market in time for this year's RSV season. So the US FDA has already just approved GSK's Arexvy, and Pfizer's Abrysvo has an action date for later this month. Both vaccines, however, are going to require recommendations from the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunisation Practices before they can be launched onto the market. And the committee is going to hold its meeting in June, so we should get an idea fairly soon about that. Then in February, Ferring launched its microbiome therapy, Rebiota, and that was in the US for preventing recurrence of C. diff infections following antibiotic treatment. So the filing included just 1 phase 3 trial, but the FDA Advisory Committee panel did vote in favour of its approval. And that's been seen as stemming from a desire to have an actually regulated product in this space, because it has become dominated by various unapproved products. But competitions followed swiftly, although Ferring does have a slight head start on its major competitor, Seres Therapeutics. So Seres, its microbiome therapy, VOWST, was approved in April. And VOWST actually has a more convenient oral rather than rectal administration. So that's another interesting marketing battle that's shaping up there. And then we have a few others on this final slide. We have CSL and Unicure's hemophilia B gene therapy Hemgenix, and that's been approved in the US, making it the first gene therapy for that bleeding disorder, and also shaping up to be the most expensive drug on the market to date. The approval also, another thing about it is it's marking a shift away with gene therapy approvals away from the ultra rare diseases to the slightly more prevalent orphan indications. So CSL says it wants to market the treatment at a cost of about $3.5 million in the US, which would push it past the $3 million price tag for Bluebird Bio's gene therapy Skysona, making it the most expensive drug. CSL argues, however, that the price points would still generate significant cost savings for the healthcare system for those patients. Next, we have J&J and Idorsia. They're awaiting US and EU approval for their dual endothelin receptor antagonist iprocitentan, and that's for resistant systemic hypertension. So if approved, it's going to be the first drug of its class on the market, and it's going to be aimed at a population of about 10% of people with hypertension who don't respond well to the current standard of care options. Resistant hypertension, analysts believe, could represent a market worth about $2.5 billion a year. And finally, in this section, we're looking at Aspelis, which has achieved a milestone with the US approval in February of Syfovre, and that's the first treatment for geographic atrophy. And it also looks at it's actually set to lead this new multi-billion-dollar market for this ophthalmic disease. So over the years, many companies have tried and failed to develop a treatment for geographic atrophy. And that means that the approval of Syfovre is not just a clinical breakthrough, it's also a coup for the small biotech. And actually, Apellis is now being touted as a takeover target. Syfovre has already got off to a strong launch, but it's going to have to contend with some competition in the near future with rival Iveric Bio's similar product, Zymura. And Iveric is actually currently being bought by Astellas, which wants to get its hands on the product, which shows the interest from Big Pharma in this market. And now I'm going to hand back to Ian, who's just going to round up the presentation.
Yes, so where are we for pharma R&D in early 2023? Well, you can see that the global pipeline continued to grow strongly in size and across all the development stages, although at a slightly slower rate than we've seen previously, but I don't think there's anything to worry about there. There were fewer new active substance launches in 2022 than 2021, but it was still a strong year. And in fact, actually, there were more novel ones in 2022 than 2021, even though there were more overall in 2021. So definitely, it was a successful year. Still problems really with early clinical attrition rates remaining high. The Swiss and US firms are the main innovators in the top 10, but mid-sized companies are providing important fuel for the global pipeline. Oncology is still dominating and ever more so, but rare diseases across different therapeutic areas are also now a major focus. Cell and gene therapy projects are at an all-time high, no sign of anything slowing down there. And China has continued its emergence as an R&D global powerhouse. We expect there will be plenty to write home about in 2023. If you'd like to download the Pharma R&D report and the new active substances supplement, they're both available as a free download from our website. And we hope you'll also join us for the webinar again in 2023. And with that, I think we probably have a few minutes for some questions, Alex.
Okay, let's have a look, see what we've got coming in. Right. Got one here. I think would be good for you, Ian. Question is, what other diseases just outside the top 10 are showing big increases? I presume that means in number of products in development.
Well, I think it's pretty much, again, focused in cancer. In the report, we've got the top 25. Actually, the biggest increase in the top 25 percentage-wise is in gastrointestinal stromal cancer. And Alex talked earlier on about KRAS inhibitors. That's a really big focus for that disease. So that's doing really well, up over 20% in a single year, at number 13 in the charts. Several other cancers also showing above average increases. Melanoma at number 11, head and neck at number 18, and renal cancer at 24. Other cancers in the top 25 showing more moderate increases are myeloma, liver cancer, and NHL. Away from cancer, Parkinson's disease showed an increase, which is a kind of interesting, and not really thought of as a kind of a trendy disease maybe these days. Yes, I mentioned the full top 25 is available in the report if you'd like to see more details.
Yeah, that's good that you've got all that data to hand in your report. Okay, another question. Do you have a sense of whether 2023 will be a good year in terms of NAS launches? Okay, so probably best I have a think about that. I think so far, actually, we had an article in Pink Sheet recently about this, looking at the approval so far. It is a perennial question. I think so far the signs are that it could be good, as good as this year. There's obviously, as we've seen, I've just gone through a decent amount of new interesting products already approved. And I think thinking in terms of the US at least, and we know that that's still the most popular market for most drug launches. And so far that year's been looking pretty similar to 2022. Apparently, there have been about 18 new active substance launches approved by the FDA up until the end of April. But this month, there's an awful lot of user fee dates coming up this month, including, as we discussed, those RSV vaccine products. According to Pink Sheet, there's actually 16 novel agents with user fee dates. So that could, really supercharge this year. But I think basically we're going to have to wait and see. But yeah, it's looking good so far.
Okay, it's encouraging. Don't know if you have anything else. We're almost up on time.
Have a look at the questions. There's one asking about the impact of AI on timelines and cost and molecule selectivity versus more traditional developmental methods. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's not something we track, and I'm sure there's going to be a big impact. We're obviously focusing on kind of the science of the drugs and clinical trials and preclinical results rather than the kind of pre-discovery phase. But yeah, definitely an interesting area to watch, and obviously something that's really been in the news very much recently.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of, it's such a broad thing, AI, isn't it? And what impacts that's going to have on so many different things. But you know, there's a couple of drugs already in working their way through that have been based on AI. But I suppose maybe there's not enough yet to have a real sense of what kind of impact it's having yet. It's going to take a few years to feed through, won't it?
Yeah, I think at the moment probably there's no substitute for old-fashioned science, right?
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I think that's probably out of time now.
Okay, yeah, we're just coming up on the hour. I've got less than a minute left, so I think we should probably wrap up for now. So once again, thank you very much for listening. Just a reminder that you will be mailed a link to the recording of the webinar, which includes the slides. If you have any questions for us as well, you can send them in to us and we'll happily get back to you. And thank you very much for your attention and see you in 2024. Goodbye.
Goodbye.